Interpersonal Communication. My name is Richard Ward, and I'm going to be your instructor. To just start right out with it, today we're going to be starting out with Chapter 1, Introducing Interpersonal Communication. So without further ado, let's do this thing. So first, I want you all to know communication can be a very complex thing to define specifically, but we can look at it as this process through which people create messages, a package, if you will, using a variety of modalities and sensory channels to convey meanings within and across specific contexts. The definition that I'm going to give you basically highlights 5 features that characterize communication. So communication isn't just this one-sided thing that we just put out there and it's done. All right, communication is a process, and it's this process that unfolds over time through a series of actions that connect with the participants. All right. You also have to understand too that communicators create messages to convey specific meaning. It's the package, as I've said before. It is the package of information that's transported during communication. So when people exchange a series of messages, we call that an interaction, okay? Good communication is called an interaction. All right. Communication also is going to choose from many different modalities or forms for exchanging messages. These are going to include things from like webcams, cell phones, texting, email, handwritten letters, face-to-face, what have you. People transmit this information through various sensory channels when communicating. And these sensory channels include auditory or sound, visual being your sight, tactile being touch, olfactory being scent, oral being taste. These are all methods of transmitting communication. Communicators convey meanings within and across a seemingly endless assortment of contexts or situations. So the communication process can be described by one of 3 models depicting communication from a simple to a more complex process. The linear communication model, okay? This depicts communication as an activity in which information flows in one direction from a starting point to an end point. So there must be a message. A channel is the sensory dimension or dimensions along which that message is sent. The sender or senders of the message is the individual or individuals who generate the information to be communicated, packages into a message, and chooses the channel for sending. Noise is anything going on in the background. It's any environmental factor that may impede messages from reaching a specific destination. And then you have the receiver or receivers, okay? And that's going to be the person for whom a message is intended and to whom the message is going to be delivered. The interactive communication model also views communication as a process involving senders and receivers. In this model, transmission is influenced by 2 additional factors though, all right? And that's going to be feedback and fields of experience. Feedback, it comprises verbal and nonverbal messages that that recipients convey to indicate their reaction to communication. Fields of experience consist of beliefs, attitudes, values, experiences that each participant brings to a communication event. So these are the ideological substances that come to a table as we start to hold communication exchanges or as we begin to communicate. The transactional communication model suggests that communication is a multi-directional process where each participant equally influences the communication behavior of the other participants. There are no senders or receivers in this model. Instead, all parties involved constantly exchange verbal and nonverbal messages and feedback and collaboratively create messages and meanings. So, communication models. In the text, it's going to explore the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the 3 different models of communication, of the 3 different communication models. Moving on, interpersonal communication can be defined as a dynamic form of communication between two or more people in which the message exchanged significantly influences thoughts, emotions, behaviors, relationships, what have you. Interpersonal communication is dynamic rather than just being static. That means that communication is constantly in motion and changing over time, right? Interpersonal communication is transactional, with both parties contributing to the meaning. And interpersonal communication is primarily dyadic, and that means involving pairs of people or dyads. The dyadic nature allows us to distinguish it from intrapersonal communication, communication only involving one person, okay? Interpersonal communication creates impact, changing the participants' thoughts, emotions, behavior, and relationships. It stands in sharp contrast to interpersonal communication, exchanges that have a negligible perceived impact on thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. Furthermore, interpersonal communication takes two forms, the I-thou and I-it. I-thou communication is going to refer to ways of relating that forge meaningful bonds that help bridge the distance between ourselves and others. We can make the distance seem thinner through our communication. The I-it communication is going to refer to ways of relating that focus on differences and amplify the view of other people, or excuse me, of the other as an object of exploitation, leading to disrespectful, manipulative, and exploitative communications. The distance between us and others thickens to the point of becoming impenetrable. So 4 principles that guide our understanding of interpersonal communication. You've got the interpersonal communication conveys both content and relationship information. So 1 is going to be content information, and that's going to be the actual meaning of the words we utter and is conveyed directly through spoken or written word. 2 is going to be the relationship information, and that's going to indicate how each person views the relationship and is conveyed primarily through nonverbal cues, vocal tone, pitch, facial expressions, hand gestures, etc. Number 3 is going to be relationship information, and that's going to strongly influence how people interpret content information. And then you've got that meta communication, right? This is communication about communication, and it includes the message, verbal or nonverbal, so both spoken and unspoken, what is meant consciously and unconsciously, and that centrally focuses on how the meaning of communication should be interpreted. Interpersonal communication can be intentional or unintentional. It is irreversible once you have said something, and you can't take it back. Once you've said it, it's out there. It is a living thing that exists within the world. So interpersonal communication is dynamic. Our communication, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and emotions are constantly in flux. No 2 interactions are going to be the same with every single person. They're not going to be identical across the spectrum, and no 2 moments within the same interaction will ever be identical. So you have to consider the context and who you're actually speaking with. Human beings are fundamentally communicative and social creatures. We need to communicate with others to be happy and healthy. Instances where you will see hermits and things of that nature who live out on their own. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the Tom Hanks movie where he has the volleyball Wilson. He creates this dynamic object out of something static, right? He creates this dynamic interpersonal relationship with a ball. And we crave that as humans. We crave that. It's healthy. We need it. We need to be able to communicate. It fulfills a profound human need for connection, okay? And it is profound. Communication is profound. We do not exist in a vacuum, and we can't exist in a vacuum. Interpersonal communication is also going to help us achieve important personal needs and practical goals. Physical needs are requirements for air, food, sleep, shelter, so on. Safety needs are going to include, forming satisfying and healthy emotional bonds with others. Self-esteem needs, these are going to be met by gaining others' respect and admiration. And then you've got the self-actualization needs, and these are met by articulating our unique abilities and giving our best in our work, our family, our personal life, and specific relationships, okay? Interpersonal communication also helps us to fulfill 3 types of goals. One is going to be our self-preservation goals, and these are desires to present ourselves to others in a particular way. I know many of you have heard, and we'll talk about this later on. We have this on-stage persona, and we have this behind the stage persona. We have this real self and stage self, okay? I don't know how many of you have ever heard the expression that when I go on a first date, you're not meeting me, you're meeting my representative. And these are self-presentation goals. These are things that we want to present, all right? Then we have instrumental goals, and these are practical aims we want to achieve or tasks we want to actually accomplish. And then we have relationship goals, and it could be interconnected to self-presentation goals. These include building, maintaining, and terminating bonds with others. By not representing a true self-presentation, we often put this in jeopardy. So we consider those things. In interpersonal communication, we have competence, and that's going to mean communicating with others in ways that are appropriate, effective, and ethical. So developing interpersonal communication competence involves 2 steps, really, both of which are going to require motivation to improve one's communication. First, you have acquiring knowledge of what it means to communicate competently. This is going to happen through social practices, the ways that we carry ourselves. And then you have translating this knowledge into communication skills, repeatable, goal-directed behaviors and behavioral patterns that you routinely practice in your interpersonal encounters and relationships. There are 3 characteristics of a competent interpersonal communication. 1, is it appropriate, or it is appropriate? It follows accepted norms. 2, it's effective. It enables you to achieve your goals. And 3, it's ethical in that you treat people fairly. Appropriateness is the degree to which your communication matches situational, relational, and cultural expectations regarding how people should communicate. We judge how appropriate our communication is through self-motivating, the process of observing our own communication and norms of the situation in order to make an appropriate communication choice. And then there's high self-monitoring. And these prefer clear expectations regarding how they're supposed to communicate. And they possess the ability and desire to alter their behavior to fit in certain social situations. And then by contrast, you have low self-monitors, and they don't assess their own communication or the situation and prefer encounters in which they can act like themselves. And however, overemphasizing appropriateness can backfire, and you need to consider that. Constantly focusing on appropriateness and adapting one's communication to the needs of others can lead to conformity of fears of being perceived negatively by others and so on. 2, you have effectiveness, and effectiveness is this ability to use communication to accomplish the 3 types of interpersonal goals discussed earlier, self-presentation, instrumental, and relationship. And finally, 3rd, you have ethics, right? And this is the set of moral principles that are going to guide our behavior towards others. We are ethically obligated to avoid intentionally hurting others through communication. Communication that expresses intolerance or hatred, that intimidates or threatens others' physical well-being, or that expresses violence is unethical and therefore incompetent. It doesn't work well. In fact, it often has an opposite effect of what you are trying to accomplish. So make sure that you see the Credo of National Communication Association for additional guidelines on ethical behaviors. This can be an excellent resource on how to communicate those specific things. So online communication poses serious, unique challenges Communicating confidently can be improved in several ways this way, though. So you want to choose your medium wisely. Know when to communicate online versus offline. Don't just assume that online communication is always more efficient. Oftentimes we can look at an online communication in a completely opposite way than what it was intended. So don't just assume online communication is the way to go. Presume that your posts are always going to be public, okay? Even if it's a message that you send through Facebook Messenger or a tweet, any of this kind of stuff, be prepared that that's going to find a public stage. Be very careful. Things that we say in person, they're a little safer. It's a little bit safer of a space than something that could come back to haunt you later on. Case in point, everybody getting videotaped doing specific things during political turmoil here in the United States, and then that video or that Facebook message then going and getting reported back to their employers and them losing their jobs. These things can have consequences and repercussions that move beyond just your initial communication methods here. So again, presume that your posts are always going to be public. And remember that they're permanent. They're out there forever. Practice the art of creating drafts. Go through, do drafts. Sometimes it's good to get the initial draft out of the way. Don't send out an initial draft, especially when you're communicating something into an online setting, a social space, or something in the public eye. Okay, never just throw out the initial draft. Go over it a couple of times. Make sure that you are entirely sure on how you want to communicate something. And I would recommend potentially pulling in other people to come in and maybe even check over what you've said, okay? 4 issues in interpersonal communication that are gaining increasing importance. These are going to be culture, gender, and sexual orientation, okay? Online communication and the dark side of interpersonal relationships. These are all gathering a more staunch focus, okay? So you have culture, gender and sexual orientation, online communication, and the dark side of interpersonal relationships. Now, interpersonal relationships, the dark side of interpersonal communication tends to be my specific milieu. That is where most of my research delves and the things that I look into. I look in how people become manipulated, how certain ideological principles, culture, gender, and all these things can be used in the dark side of interpersonal communication. So, you want to understand cultural differences in interpersonal communication. They're as increasingly important in a world made smaller by technology. Culture is an established, coherent set of beliefs, attitudes, values, practices, all these shared by large groups of people, okay? It includes many different types of large group influences that include nationality, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, physical and mental abilities, and even age. And they are all perpetuated. We learn these cultural beliefs, attitudes, and values from our parents, our teachers, religious leaders, peers, and the mass media. Everything is constantly bombarding you. Your culture isn't just this one static thing. You are a product of so many bombardments of cultural influences. All these things go into all of your decision making, both consciously and unconsciously. Focus on culture and intercultural competence, okay? Understanding cultural differences in communication is the first step toward an intercultural communication competence. Students, you should also remember that you should remember these suggestions, okay? First, think globally. Second, learn appropriateness. Be respectful and respectfully inquisitive. Use simple language and be patient with yourself and others, okay? Remember to take into consideration where you came from, where you were born, all of the culture that goes into making you who you are, okay? Keep in mind that when you're speaking on an intercultural competence level, you're speaking to a group that did not grow up within that same set of cultural values, practices, beliefs, attitudes, and all those things, okay? Consider these things. It makes for a more intellectual understanding and communication, all right? Gender and sexual orientation, they are very important issues, especially within the study of contemporary interpersonal communication. So by gender, I mean, it's this social, psychological, cultural traits generally associated with one sex or another, okay? We're not talking about the scientific understanding of sex, male versus female. We are talking about a socially constructed concept of gender, okay? And what we should do and not do, okay? Gender, you have to understand, is not the same as biological sex, which we are assigned at birth. And it's largely learned and influenced by the culture you grow up in, right? While scholars are going to disagree about the relationships between gender and communication, you have to understand that there is a clear difference between even US norms, even regional norms, between what is accepted or how gender is influenced by culture. So those who grow up in traditional, more conservative, like myself, I grew up in Dublin, Georgia. I grew up in an area where gender roles were very specific. Men did this, women did that. You know, men hunter-gatherers, women cooks, cleans, things of that nature. It was very specific. Now, I am not here to influence you on the rightness or the wrongness of either one. Like I said, these come from cultural points. I do study this in depth, and I do have my personal opinions on the matter. That being said, I'm not here to say this is the right way, this is the wrong way. But you have to understand that those that grow up in those kinds of households are going to be different than those who grow up in a more progressive atmosphere, say in New York City. And even those very conservative gender norms are going to differ between us and other countries. In certain African tribal countries, gender is very fluid. In the early Americas, Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti, the Taino tribes there grew up with a very different context of what makes gender. Gender was not just man and woman. Gender was very fluid, had a lot of different definitions, had a lot of different sub sections on that gender. So this isn't just some new concept, okay? Gender is the fact that we put this out there. Gender is not a new concept, okay? Or gender fluidity is not a new concept, I should say. So keep that in mind as you go out and you start to experience the world and your professions, because that is going to come in very, very important, okay? Come in handy. And sexual orientation, that's going to be the enduring emotional, romantic, sexual, or affectionate attraction to others. This orientation exists along a continuum that ranges from exclusive homosexuality to exclusive heterosexuality, and that includes various forms of bisexuality and pansexuality. The list goes on, okay? There is there is a wide romantic or a wide sexual orientation palette that you don't necessarily have to believe in, but you do have to understand intellectually to be able to participate within communication standards. Same gender and opposite gender relationships are formed, maintained, and dissolved in similar ways as other times, or as they are with each other. Okay, so same gender and opposite gender relationships, the formation, the maintenance, and all of that stuff, the way that they dissolve, all of that happens in similar ways. Okay, homosexuals and heterosexuals fall in line of making specific relationships the same way. Radical changes in communication technology have had a very profound effect on our ability to interpersonally communicate. These examples can be online communication such as Facebook, emails, text messages, Skype, all that good stuff, okay? You have to understand that because interpersonal communication can sometimes be destructive, examining the dark side of these interpersonal relationships has become a very important issue. And that's where I try to come in and delve down into how these certain things happen, the ways that certain relationships click, right? These communications click, both specifically in somewhat negative ways. So when it comes to making relationship choices and dealing with a difficult friend, okay, you want to communicate competently, and to do so can be pretty challenging when others provoke us, and that's just the way of the beast. That said, if you have any further questions concerning any of the material in Chapter 1, the introduction into interpersonal communication, I would highly recommend you email me about it. Beyond that, thanks for attending this seminar, and I hope to see you guys all again soon within the next lecture. Thanks.